welcome. We have people come into the chat joining. So I'm Anthony Simasek. I'm a board member of the Virginia Club of New York here in New York City. Thank you all for joining tonight. I'm also co-chair of Who's in Entrepreneurship. We're one of the two communities of interest that are co-sponsoring tonight's event. The other one is Who's Hungry, also out of the UVA Club of New York. So I just wanted to thank everyone for joining us. I know a lot of you are probably joining maybe from out of New York City or out of state. So if you don't mind in the chat, just letting us know where you're from. We're excited to see if people are joining us outside of New York City this evening. And that's one of the great things that we found with Zoom is the ability to include our UVA alumni from all over, like Chicago. Woolley, Brooklyn is in New York, but it's great to have everyone from all over be able to take part in this. And it's even more exciting for us to welcome such a great panel for tonight's event. We're really excited about the panelists we have, and we've had a really amazing outpouring of registrants for tonight's event. So it's going to be really exciting. And I just wanted to real quick before we get started go over a few logistical things. This is a webinar, so that means that you all are muted with the exception of our panelists. So if you do have questions, there is a Q&A option in Zoom. There's also the chat. Katie and I will be monitoring them, and at the end we will definitely save some time for your questions that we can ask our panelists as well as Katie. So if you have questions for Katie Egan, please feel free to throw those out there. And then lastly, if there's any issues that you're having with technical issues or anything, UVA Clubs is Daniil. So thank you very much to the UVA Office of Engagement for their help in putting on this event tonight, as well as Lydia McVeigh, our executive director here in New York, for all of her guidance and help. And Juliana, Margot, Sokian, and Allison Geller, who were a big part of bringing us together. So without any further ado, I will introduce Katie Egan, who is a classmate of mine from 2008 from undergraduate at the University of Virginia. After graduating, Katie spent some time with Bain Consulting before getting her MBA at Stanford, and then went on to kind of run the gamut in food service delivery apps, I guess, from Amazon and Caviar and Square and Caviar. And now Katie is the chief of staff for DoorDash. So we are very excited to have Katie as our moderator tonight, and I will turn it over to her and let her introduce the rest of our panelists.
Great. So I think what I'll kick off with a few observations about the restaurant and hospitality space over the past 2 years, and a little bit about why I'm excited about this conversation and optimistic about the future of our industry. And then I'll have the panelists introduce themselves and sort of answer my first question altogether. So three observations about the past 2+ years. Number one, the pandemic greatly accelerated consumers' desire for convenience and adoption of new behaviors. So our read on kind of what happened for consumers in the restaurant and hospitality space is less that like the pandemic created new behaviors and more that it accelerated the realization that you can get things conveniently, or that you can have hospitality in a lot of different ways that maybe you weren't aware of before. We think this is sort of a trend that was happening that the pandemic really accelerated. I can speak from my personal experience to say that overnight, my parents who live outside of Nashville, Tennessee, who had never ordered groceries on an app or gotten their sort of Friday night date night spot delivered, did both of those things within weeks of the pandemic starting. But what's kind of exciting is that they continue to do those things. And we see that peak pandemic behaviors that started because they had to start are persisting even today as the pandemic becomes the new normal. And what I think is the most exciting about this is that creative operators across the industry found new ways to deliver incredible food and hospitality experiences whether through putting meal kits together so that people could cook their favorite restaurant dishes at home, or operating takeout only restaurants in spaces that were originally designed for fine dining. And there's a myriad of other examples that we'll get into tonight about how operators pivoted. And so I think the bottom line there is that there will always be opportunity for folks who are willing to embrace change. Sometimes that change is really uncomfortable and maybe not desirable, but there's still some pretty cool upside in what it forces. Number two, the pandemic showed us just how essential restaurants and restaurant workers are to our communities. And it led to major disruptions in the labor market. So Bureau of Labor Statistics estimates that 8 million people dropped out of the workforce in 2020. And as of the end of 2021, 2.4 million of them did not return. And that includes about 800,000 fewer 18 to 34-year-olds in the workforce. That is a very big shift. This dynamic hit the restaurant industry particularly hard. 65% of operators that we talked to reported reducing business hours due to staffing shortages, and a majority believe that staffing will be their number one challenge for at least the next year. This is a pretty big challenge for restaurant and hospitality industry operators. Working in a restaurant's hard work. I'm married to someone who spent 10 years in the restaurant industry, and it was hard work before the pandemic introduced new concerns around safety, new issues with potential conflicts with diners. But on the bright side, the pandemic brought the experience of restaurant workers to the forefront of the national conversation, not just for industry insiders. And we'll talk more tonight about how this awareness has helped drive progress for the restaurant industry. Final observation, if you are not aware from sort of your personal ordering habits, the supply chain has been completely disrupted over the past 2 years, both from pandemic-driven issues and also more recently, the instability of the global economy. A whopping 96% of operators have reported supply shortages or delays, and 8 in 10 full-service restaurant operators and 65% of quick-service restaurant operators have changed their menus because of supply chain constraints. So it's a pretty tough environment to be in. But something that we say a lot at DoorDash that I fully believe in is that constraints breed creativity. While the industry has experienced a ton of change that has disrupted how we used to do things, I'm excited to see how operators in hospitality have worked around these constraints. For example, by creating new products, rebuilding a more locally focused supply chain, or fostering a more sustainable work environment for hospitality workers. There will always be opportunity for operators who embrace change. And that is why I'm so excited to speak with our panelists today about change in our industries and in our personal careers and how we think about changes ahead for the future. So by way of introduction, I'd love for each panelist to introduce yourself and then share a little bit about what got you from UVA to where you are today. And I'll start with Jacqueline.
Sure. Good afternoon, or good evening, I should say. Hi, everybody, and happy to be here. So Jacqueline Grace, everyone just calls me Jackie. I'll start with a little bit before UVA. So I spent 9 years on Wall Street and then went off to business school at Darden. When it was time to pivot, my second probably big career pivot from financial services, I had two options in mind. I was either going to become an entrepreneur or I wanted to do something in the hospitality space. The primary reason is because when I think about hospitality, I really do think about it as a giant people business. And it is just that, right? You got thousands of team members whom you're serving, tens of thousands of guests whom you're serving and hoping to provide a memorable experience. And then if you're doing it right, serving the community. And so hospitality gave me the opportunity to do that. So when I left Darden, I joined Caesars Entertainment. And I've been with Caesars Entertainment for almost 12 years, worked in various markets, primarily all in the Northeast. So I started in Atlantic City, worked in Maryland, then outside of Philadelphia, and then most recently back in Atlantic City. So I currently serve as the general manager of the Tropicana in Atlantic City. The Tropicana is a 2,200 room hotel, 2,000 slot machines, 100 table games, 122,000 square foot of meeting space, be a 200,000 square foot retail dining and entertainment complex. So between the two facilities, there are 15 restaurants, 15 bars and lounges, 20 retail shops, spas, pools, a theater, an IMAX theater, etc. So quite a complex operation, and it touches everything from, again, restaurants to hotels and everything in between. So happy to be here.
Thanks. And Sean.
Guys, first of all, I want to say I see a lot of New York City Wahoos on this chat, especially Brooklyn. So I love to see it. Absolutely love to see it. I graduated Virginia in 2003. I went right to Wall Street, Goldman Sachs for a number of years, and then went to a hedge fund called Anchorage Capital. And in 2008, I married my high school sweetheart, and we moved into an apartment in the West Village, right above a single bedroom apartment of Misi Robbins. And I was a massive fan of food since the time I was 5 years old, growing up in New Jersey with my parents, taking me out to great restaurants and having awesome Sunday suppers, dinners every night as a family. They invested heavily in us. It was their number one investment. And I knew the day that Misi moved into this apartment building in 2009, I had to be her friend. And for the first couple of years, it was embarrassing. I was a big fanboy. I would go to her restaurant, A Voce, where she was the executive chef. She got 2 Michelin stars there. And she would come out to the table and do the whole shaving truffles on my pasta with my business associates or my family. So she made me feel good around them. But I guess in 2012, I was at Anchorage and there was Hurricane Sandy hit New York City. And Misi had to close her restaurants down that night. I invited her up to my apartment and I cooked her dinner. Actually, I cooked her pasta, which is to this day probably the scariest thing I've ever done. But she liked that pasta. We spoke the whole night, and 2 years later, we became family. And she wanted to open up her own restaurant, and nobody was giving her the chance to do it. And I didn't have any entrepreneurial aspirations whatsoever, but I had this belief in her. And I just blurted out, why don't we do this? Let's do it. And she said no. And for 4 months, I said to her every night we should do it. She said no. And finally, one night she said yes. So in 2014, we started this hospitality company in the West Village in this townhouse called Grovehouse, because it was on Grove Street. And 2 years later, after 40 places looking at, we found this space in North Williamsburg and opened a restaurant in 2016 called Lilia. And then in 2018, opened Misi and became owners of Hometown Barbecue and Red Hook Tavern. And I finally could leave my day job of high yield bond investor at Anchorage. And in 2019, we decided that we were gonna start a pasta company because that was a dream of Misi's. And we spent the entire year of 2019 building this pasta company and what it would look like. And in 2020, in January, the first weekend, it was snowing. Begrudgingly, Misi agreed to do the first Misi pasta drop. And she hates the use of that word because it's so millennial, but I love it. And she didn't think it would work. And we decided that we were gonna do it on a Saturday afternoon at Misi, the restaurant. We put it out on Instagram the night before. We only made 70 bags of pasta and sauce, and 250 people showed up while it was snowing, and we had a pasta company. And we did that until March, when we had to shut everything down. And fortunately, we were able to survive, and the restaurants are back. The pasta company is growing and exciting. It's essentially taking these experiences that we want you to have in our restaurants and allowing you to create them at home and finding really cool ways to do it with you. And we're going to be opening up a pizzeria, a very small pizzeria in about 40 days, about a block away from my apartment. And we're just really excited. I became the co-chair of the Food Education Fund in 2019 and have been a part of that since 2018, and co-founder of ROAR, which is a coalition of restaurant owners in New York City. And we're just trying to help restaurant workers live healthier lives. So I'm so happy to be here with you all and excited to hear everybody else.
And if folks haven't been to Lilia or Misi, it's life-changing pasta. So highly recommend. Juliana is selling you on DoorDash in the chat. So I'll let the two of you take that up, no conflict.
We do our own delivery, unfortunately.
I know. All right, great. And then talking to a DoorDash partner, Andrew.
Hi. I have two thoughts, and the other panelists don't have to respond, but as they were speaking, I was just thinking of them. First is for Jackie, and it's like, how do you even have time to sit down with us with what you just described? Like, I am just excited that you're here for some amount of time with us. That is mind-boggling. And then for Sean, I'm just wondering if you've ever thought about what would have happened if that pasta dish had bombed that you cooked that night. Would things have been different? But anyways, so I graduated from the comm school in 2005, and it seems like entrepreneurship in Charlottesville is really flourishing, which I'm excited about. When I was there, there was one elective class you could take, and it was basically you and 3 other people get to write a group business plan together. And I convinced my group to do mine because I told them there was actually a chance I would do it. And it was for a healthful, quick service restaurant concept, which at the time didn't really exist. So left UVA business plan in hand. The only problem is I'd never worked in a restaurant before. So for the next 2 or 3 years, started bouncing around. I was worked at Panera, worked at Moe's Southwest Grill, which is a burrito shop in the Southeast, and traveled a little bit. And then in 2008, I had a buddy who was in New York City and said there was this place called the Pump Energy Food that really reminded him of my business plan, and I should come up and check it out. If you've ever eaten at the Pump Energy Food, please drop a line in the chat. I'm just curious who knows about it and remembers it, but it was pretty much fast food for weightlifters. And it's sort of like what health food was in the early 2000s. So it was like egg white omelets, like 60 grams of protein, tasted like cardboard, and it like had no flavor. So that's how you knew it was health food, because that's the way health food was supposed to be at the time. But it was the closest thing to my business plan. It was health food. And so I moved up to New York and started working for the Pump Energy Food. And in that time, I met a small group of people who were sort of involved in that organization. We had 5 or 6 restaurants in New York City. And, you know, what healthful eating meant to us was sort of changing as it was changing to others outside of us. So it was less about calorie counting, a lot about flavor as well, a lot about sourcing, and a lot about like looking at a really complicated food system and making the best decisions you can. So, you know, we took the Pump in 2008, and 3 years after I got there in 2011, we founded Egan. And it's sort of been, you know, pretty exciting from there. People really took to it. It really took off like a rocket ship. We were up to, I think, 32 restaurants in February of 2020, February of 2020. And then COVID hit. You know, it crushed everyone in the restaurant industry, and it was not a great time to be a restaurant group that was focused in Midtown Manhattan in the office lunch community. But we were fortunate that we had enough people that believed in us, were willing to, you know, invest in our future, help us get through the pandemic. And our restaurants were 32, dropped down to 8, and now we're sort of back up to 30. So getting close to an at least restaurant count to where we were before the pandemic. And I know, you know, for me personally, it's just really exciting that, you know, there's a lot of time when I thought this might be the end, and it's cool to see Dig continue to evolve and grow, and, you know, hopefully serve a lot more vegetables to people. If you've never eaten at any of our restaurants, we're in New York, we are in Boston, we are in Philadelphia, and soon to be DC. So give it a try. I think you'll like it. It's a good, quick lunch or dinner option. And yeah, I think that's all I got.
So something you touched on a little bit in sort of seeing where health food could go before that was so obvious to everyone, right? When you founded Dig, this was not, you know, healthy fast casual was not ubiquitous the way that it is today. And then Sean, you also touched on like wanting to invest in Misi while no one else wanted to invest in her opening her own restaurant, convincing her to do pasta drops when nobody thought that was going to work. And both of those examples struck me as sort of classic examples of entrepreneurship, which is really about seeing an opportunity and believing in it when it's not so obvious, because if it were so obvious, it would already be built. Curious, you know, advice from either of you. What have you learned about your ability to spot those opportunities and act on them? What advice would you have for folks on the call about seeing things that others don't see?
You want to go, Andrew?
Sure. I would say for me, it's this healthy and sometimes actually painful sort of mix of optimism and skepticism. And it's like this belief in yourself that just because no one else sees it, you might be seeing something that no one else sees. There's a confidence there. And then it's a skepticism to be pretty ruthless with your evaluation of that, idea, hypothesis, or whatever, once you've sort of put it into action, and not become too wed to the idea that, you have necessarily seen something. And that sort of bipolar, I guess, approach can be pretty painful, but it's critical to have both sides of that, I think.
Yeah, from the example of Misi, when I had this feeling that I wanted to be her partner, I wasn't even thinking that I was going to be at the restaurant ever. I didn't think I was going to be a restaurateur. I was just going to stay in my job in finance and be on the side to help her manage the business, possibly operations, but never change professions. And I guess like I never had aspirations to be an entrepreneur and have my own business, but I guess believe, sometimes if you don't believe in yourself, you could possibly believe in somebody else. And if you can't find something to fight for yourself, I guess you shouldn't be afraid to help someone else's fight. And in doing so, that might lead to some pretty amazing things. And I guess for me, that led to a belief that I wasn't enough in my job of finance. I liked it. There were times where I loved it. I never felt like I was extraordinary or in control in those 13 years in finance. And I was in some pretty amazing institutions. But I think when I became her partner and realized I was going to the restaurant every night, and I never felt so alive, walking the floors, making people happy. It's all I ever did growing up, whether I played on UVA's soccer team. I was never the best. I just tried to be the best teammate. And when I was in finance, I was never the best. I just loved, everybody wanted me to be around. Everybody wanted to take me to the restaurants at night to entertain. And I guess now I was just doing that on the floor of a restaurant. And that led me to feel like, well, what's so different now? And it was more about just feeling comfortable with who I was, not what I did. And who I was I made everybody try to feel good. I tried to positively impact the day. And that all became, my life's mission from here on out. No matter what I do, I'm going to lead with that. And that made me extraordinary in the hospitality industry. And that made our restaurants extraordinary. That made everybody want to work with us every day and feel proud to come to work every day. That's what I hoped that I had every day going to work at Goldman and Anchorage. And I guess that's really the biggest thing when the pandemic happened. It was just understanding who I was. And even though our restaurants were closed and we couldn't feed people inside of them, that didn't mean we couldn't feed people. That couldn't mean we couldn't make days better for people. Even though I had a mask on every day, I was delivering pasta to Hamptons and Connecticut and New Jersey. And I can't believe what I was doing in those months and days. But it kept me alive because I was able to do something to make someone's day better. Even though I couldn't see a smile, it made me feel amazing. And then the biggest reward from that moment when our restaurants were closed, it was having people come back to work in this new company. And they were doing jobs completely different than their old jobs. And they were doing them as great as ever. And they were defining themselves by who they were and not what they did. They weren't paralyzed. I was at Goldman in 2008, right before I got married in September of 2008. I got married when the weekend that Bank of America
that weekend.
And Bear Stearns went down. And I was 26 years old. I didn't have the resources that I do now. I didn't have the savviness or wherewithal. I was scared. I was paralyzed. I was more worried that I was going to lose my job, and I was marrying Maria and I didn't know what I was going to do. And that felt tough. But with this crisis, I was like, all right, well, I can be in control still. Everybody's safe. We're not going to open the restaurants until everybody's okay to come back in. And let's look for the opportunities now. And because I was able to define myself by who I was. And I was comfortable with that too.
I love that. I also see kind of your mission to help people, make people happy, show up in your work with Roar. So for folks who are less familiar, at the very beginning of the pandemic, Sean helped establish Roar New York, which raised, I think it's over 3 million, correct me if it's bigger than that now, to provide economic relief to restaurants and restaurant workers, and now includes advocacy efforts and health and wellness services. So I'd love to hear you talk a little bit about kind of your work to not just make customers happy, but really like improve the lives of restaurant workers, and where you see restaurant labor in particular going.
Yeah, I mean, the thing that I'm most proud of are the people that I get to work with in our restaurants. They're basically making it their life's work to make days better for everybody. And most of those people, they don't even know. And when we had to shut down, it was the most awesome responsibility of my life that I was now in charge of people. And when we had to shut down, it was a sad day because I couldn't say, you're safe to come to work. I literally said it was unsafe to come to work. And that meant their financial security and health was really in risk. And that's not to say they didn't have great livings. Our teams do extremely well, but when these businesses stop, you can't really afford to keep paying people. It's not Goldman Sachs. So what we were able to do though is we were able to get everybody, because our businesses are very healthy, and we were able to have enough money in the bank to guarantee everybody what they would get paid for 3 months, and their health insurance was covered. We did a lot of stuff for mental health, and we kept it all together for at least 3 months. And I thought it was going to last for six weeks. And in order to do that, we raised in 48 hours, like $200,000 from a GoFundMe. And it made me realize how strong this community is that we've built of guests and neighbors and friends. So a couple of my friends who own restaurants called me up after they saw this GoFundMe thing, and they're like, hey, let's raise more money for other restaurant workers. And I'm like, I'm in, let's go. And so we partnered up with Robinhood, so that we didn't have a 501c3 at that moment, but Robinhood is a big one. And they were able to link up with us, and we put up a website, and it was simply to raise money for restaurant workers so that they could go online and tell us where they worked, which restaurant, and overnight they got $500 or $1,000 based on how many years they worked there. And over that summer was amazing, because it was like Forrest Gump when Forrest Gump went out to fish for Bubba Gump for the shrimps, and the shrimps were just jumping on the boat. That was like that summer. It was like, how can we think of awesome ways to raise money? And there were companies just coming at us like, we're going to do t-shirt drops, we're going to do cookie drop. Like, it was insane. So that summer we raised over $3 million. It all went to restaurant workers immediately. And then what was cool about that was, like, a lot of restaurant owners were talking to each other finally, like,
right.
Like for real, not just like, hey, this was the best quarter ever this year. Like, people were freaked out. So we were very vulnerable with each other and like talking through challenges. And because of Lilia and Misi and all the big time people that come there, I was going to weekly meetings with Chuck Schumer and Mario Cuomo, Governor Cuomo, not Mario, but
Andrew
and de Blasio. And I'm like, all right, I need everybody's help here and information. And it became a therapy session and problem solving session. And then once that summer ended, we were like, well, we can't stop this. And so we came up with this idea to make a vaccine bus, where once we got vaccines, we went to all these restaurants and just vaccinated restaurant workers as soon as we could. And we were able to get 25,000 restaurant workers vaccinated in like the first week. And the mayor was like, we're making 22 more of these things. And then we ran the New York City Marathon, raised $1 million, and it all went to like mental health companies, financial health companies that gave restaurant workers an accessibility and affordability to these benefits of health and wellness. And I think the exodus of labor from New York is not something that just started. It's been going on for 7 years. But I think the pandemic just made a lot of people realize, like, why am I struggling like this? Why am I living this life? And maybe I'll just go back home. And there's no doubt our industry is short, and not unlike a lot of other industries. But what I'm excited about mostly is in New York City, we have an amazing talent pool of future hospitality professionals, and we just got to go find them. And they're young adults, and there are many high schools out there that are focused on culinary arts and hospitality and entrepreneurship. And those programs are going to grow. And to me, like, that's my bet. That's going to be my bet, to continue to grow only in New York City. I'm never going to go to another city, but because I have so much belief in the youth and talent that New York City has, and they're not leaving us. So there's no doubt we have to try to serve others who make it their lives to serve. And we just got to figure out ways to do it creatively and compassionately, those two main ingredients of hospitality, but really cultivate the youth, because they want to serve and they want to make days better for people. And to me, that's exciting.
How do you see like the job of working at a restaurant changing over time? Like, do you think that we'll see meaningful shifts in what it is to be a server, be a bartender, be a floor manager?
Yeah, I think people, as they should during the pandemic, really reflect and figure out what matters to them and how they want to live their life, because it is short. Every day's great. They're hard though. Everyone is hard, but it is short. And I think a lot of people were able to reflect finally and take a breather, no matter what they were in. But I do think in restaurants, especially the ones, we've run so far, those independent, casual, fine dining, fine casual restaurants, where there are a lot of people that are needed. I think over time, technology is going to help with that. If there is still a shortage, there won't necessarily be the need for some of these positions. But we're also just going to figure out ways to make the quality of life better, really, and try to get real healthcare and benefits to people, when it's unrealistic at this moment to offer everyone free healthcare. It's just not feasible. But there are ways to offer things that, whether it's private and public fundraising and doing great partnerships with all sorts of great companies. There's ways to do it, but we just have to try and figure it out.
Yeah, and keep innovating.
Yeah.
So Jacqueline, I can't imagine the level of complexity you dealt with in thinking about your various different groups of customers, employees, general public, and the community that you lead in, because your business has such a massive presence in the community. One of the things that came up for me when just hearing you talk about the pandemic is the situations in which, you might not know what the right call is, or customers and employees and the community might not all see eye to eye. And I think one of the things that UVA strives to do is really build ethical citizens. So I'm curious, how did you navigate that tension between wanting to help and serve your customers, wanting to do what's right by your employees, wanting to do what's right by your community? And can you talk about some of the tough calls that you had to make over the last couple of years?
Sure. So, to your point, it was tough, like not easy at all. I will say on the front end, I think we were helped in some of those calls, meaning like in some ways we were mandated to do some things. And so that helped take the pressure off of decision making, because there was some. So I'll just kind of give you some examples. And I think Sean referred to it as well. I recall, call it February of 2020, right? When things were starting to unfold and we were all trying to figure out like what was happening. And everybody, I know it seems like a blur, but everybody remembers what that was like, especially if you were in the industry. And before we knew anything, right, we just knew there were recommendations like you must have hand sanitizer, as an example, right? And I think everybody probably remembers the hand sanitizer shortage, right? Like you couldn't find any. And that was even with us being proactive and trying to buy up as much hand sanitizer as possible. I was still in Maryland at the time, but as a company, right, we used our buying power. Caesars Entertainment was, it's currently 50 properties. So we used our buying power to try to get as much PPE as possible. So it was masks and hand sanitizer, et cetera. But as you again recall, there was a shortage. And I remember it was probably like a day before we were forced to shut down. And I started to really wrestle with this inability to procure enough hand sanitizer, right? Like we had it and then we were trying to ration it out. And like, again, we were like making policies about like how much hand sanitizer should be used and who gets it first and what's the order, and just madness, right? When you think about it now. And again, it was almost like right before we like had to make the call to, or we were forced to shut down, like was really wrestling and started having the conversations to say, hey, like we're teetering on the brink of like not being able to supply enough hand sanitizer to everyone. And that was making folks uncomfortable, right? Again, we had it, but looking at it like dwindle and again, trying to ration it out, you couldn't help but understand some of the tension that team members were feeling, which was like, do we have enough? Am I going to have some tomorrow when I come to work? And so again, as I indicated earlier, luckily, I don't even know if I should say that, but like the decision was made for us, right? Like once it was decided that like all of the properties were closed, to be honest, there was a little bit of a sigh of relief, right? Because what I was wrestling with was how do I keep everyone safe? And nor did anyone else, we didn't have the tools to do so. And so while closing the property was will probably go down in the top 3 like most devastating things that I've ever had to do and experience, right? Particularly at that time working in Baltimore City. But again, if you think about the makeup of the hospitality industry, the folks who were laid off are the folks who can least afford to be laid off, and having to do that in mass numbers again throughout the entire country, that was tough. One of the toughest things that I've ever had to do in my career. And we provided a ton of support to bridge the gap. I'm really proud of what the company did for our team members, but nonetheless, it was tough. But even that, it felt better than feeling like they were coming to a place where they weren't going to be safe. So that's kind of one example on the front end. And then I'd say on the back end, once all of the properties reopened several months later, we had spent as a company the entire time that the properties were closed, we essentially were working on what were our health and safety protocols going to be, right? How would we reopen when we got the green light to reopen and do it in such a way that we were keeping our team members and our guests safe? And so I felt really good about the protocols that we enacted. And I think the team did a fantastic job at executing them. And I will say, again, there was still a lot of unknown. I don't know that we made everyone happy, right? We were doing all the things that CDC said we needed to do. We did all the things that we were required to do, but because there was so much uncertainty, I think people still just weren't sure, right? Like whether, they were entirely protected. So navigating through that was tricky. But again, I think we did a really good job. I'm proud of the team for what they were able to do for each other, as well as for our guests.
So one of the ways that DIG has gotten a lot of attention for taking care of its company and team is through introducing a company-wide 4-day work week. So Andrew, I'm curious if you could tell us a little bit about why you introduced a 4-day work week and some of the results that you've seen.
Sure. Well, I guess I really hesitate for a lot of the things DIG does, particularly the positive ones, to personalize it, but I'm going to go ahead and do it this time. And that sort of like my definition of success, and I think, when you're involved heavily in a business, knowing what that means to you is pretty important. If you hear, the way Sean spoke, I think it's pretty obvious what he views as success in what his business is doing. For me, it has been almost from the beginning, my definition was always how it impacts the people who work for you, particularly knowing in our business, we're notorious in limited service for being about as bad as it gets. And for most of the first decade, I gave myself pretty poor grades, honestly, as to what DIG did. I don't think we were, worse than our peers. I think maybe we were even better than a bunch of them in terms of taking care of our people, but it's a pretty bad pool you're comparing yourself to. It's a low bar, right? And so one of the things I will definitely say during COVID, things did slow down for all the wrong reasons, but they did. And there was some bright spots through all of that. And, I was able to focus on some of these things that I just, as the business was taking off like a rocket ship, was not successful in doing. And in July of 2020, we had 6 restaurants in Boston that had dropped to 1. And just doing that was brutal. It was brutal in Boston. It was brutal everywhere. But I was having sort of a sob session, a sulk session with our area leader. And he said, I don't know if I should tell you this, but, because we've taken the leadership of 6 restaurants and condensed it. We're able to give people 4-day work weeks right now. And that's been really great for them with everything they're dealing with. And so the follow-up question I had is, well, do you think you could do that for the whole team? And he said, I don't know, but I'm going to try. We have literally an all-star team that's still with us in Boston. And let's see if we can figure this thing out. So with no resources, the ask of them was, I want you to see if you can figure this out, but you don't get any extra labor budget because we just don't have it right now. So you have to do it as if you were running the restaurant. And it was a puzzle. It was a highly motivated, uniquely talented team. They were able to figure it out and create our first successful pilot for the 4-day work week. And so from there, it's sort of grown and spread to the point where in April of this year, we were able to offer it as a benefit, as an option for all our hourly employees. So there's a few qualifiers in there. It is not an option for our support team and the people that support our restaurants yet. It's always something that if we were going to do successfully had to be bottom up. So maybe one day we'll see. It's not an option for our salaried managers yet. They're the ones we're looking at now. But for all our hourly employees now, it's offered as an option and as a benefit. It's not mandatory. It doesn't work for a lot of people. We guarantee people their hours still. So it means you have to work 10-hour shifts, and that's not great for everybody.
Right.
But offering it as an option has been really cool and has really been, I've heard the word life-changing for this initiative more, than I have in the previous decade. And you just start to see those specific words through surveys, through people saying them in multiple languages come up enough times, and you start to feel like you're onto something. So it's been really exciting. At the same time, we're still pretty early in the journey for it. Adoption hasn't been nearly as high as we'd like. So there's definitely some internal enrollment we have to do. There's a lot of skepticism around it and what's the catch. So on one hand, it's been really exciting. It's been really cool to be able to do it. It's been really fulfilling personally, but we have a long way to go on it.
I would totally opt into that if I could, because I'm pretty brain dead by Friday anyway. So, I don't think the productivity that DoorDash gets out of me on a Friday is as high as it is on a Monday after a good weekend.
Yeah, I mean, and one thing, just to jump in, one thing that I love about it for hourly workers, I do read a lot about the studies and the office workforces who do them. And I always wonder, okay, so if you don't get to all your work in the 4 days, what happens then? Or do you turn off your email on Fridays, right? The great thing about an hourly workforce is that extra day off is really a day off.
Right.
It's fantastic. It's one less day of commuting. It's one less day of thinking about work. It's great.
Well, we've been on a more heavy topic of sort of the challenges of working and leading in the industry. So I'll pivot us a little bit to some more fun and lighthearted topics. So having married someone in the restaurant industry, I think some of the best parts of looking behind the curtains are the behind the scenes, funny, surprising celebrity moments that you get to experience. So I'd love for folks to share a favorite behind the scenes or celebrity encounter from your time working in the industry.
Yeah, I hate doing that because it's just so crazy to me in the years that we've been opening these restaurants and seeing so many of these famous people come in. Misi and I look at each other. First of all, Misi could care less about any celebrity, and I don't either. But it's just we shake our heads sometimes. We hate talking about it. I will say, for me, there's been a celebrity that I desperately wanted to come to the restaurant. The only one. It's Bruce Springsteen, the boss from New Jersey. I'm
Classic
from
New Jersey answer.
And I desperately want Bruce Springsteen. And anybody on this chat, any of you who's on this chat knows Bruce Springsteen, send to Brooklyn. And I will say that the summer that I was doing all the delivering of pasta, I had a buddy from high school tell me Bruce is staying in Bay Head, and he sent me a picture of his house. So I was delivering pasta in Bay Head, and sure enough, I was going up and down Bay Head after delivering pasta for 7 hours in New Jersey, and I found the house. And I went to deliver the pasta to his door, no security. He answers the door. I had my moment. I told him, I tried so hard to be okay. And then Bradley Cooper walks behind him of like, hey, we had dinner together at your restaurant. And I'm like, oh my God, here it is. Here it is. Like Bradley Cooper's here. He's going to tell Bruce to come to the restaurant, which he did. I put my card in his bag. I thought it was all set. That was 2 years ago. He hasn't been to the restaurant. So I think that, the next time I'm on this Zoom with everybody, hopefully you ask that question and it's Bruce Springsteen.
I love it. Maybe with Bradley Cooper.
That's a great story. It's a hard act to follow. I'll just like pick one. Common performed at the property in Maryland. And before his performance, he had dinner we have a Gordon Ramsay steakhouse there. And so he had dinner at the steakhouse. And I would just say he was just really kind. He was kind and gracious and, was even accommodating to autograph requests, which we generally don't like to do, right? Like if a celebrity is there, want to let them have their space. But he was even accommodating to that, which I thought was nice. He didn't have to do that. So it's a good experience.
Love that. Did you get to see like his green room list of must-haves?
He was pretty low key. I've seen some others that's
don't out anyone, but what is the most absurd green room request that you've seen?
Oh my gosh, I'm drawing a blank. I can't think of the most absurd, but I remember there was one that was like an insane amount of chicken wings. I know you think, all right, like, but it was just an insane amount. I'm like, who eats that many chicken?
Like tens of thousands.
It was like an insane amount of chicken wings, and the other was like M&Ms, and it was like very specific colored M&Ms. That was the other one.
I've heard of the M&M one. I think that's a famous one.
Yes.
Yeah, I love that. Andrew, do you have any good behind the scenes moments from Dig? Doesn't have to be celebrity.
We have a few, like most of our celebrity things are one step removed. You'll see their names on orders and stuff. One of my favorites was from like the pump days really early on. Someone from Serena's crew used to come in around the US Open. She used to like shakes, apparently. And then I guess once in one of our restaurants, I allegedly sat next to Jake Gyllenhaal for an hour. I didn't notice it or recognize it. I was told after the fact, just completely oblivious.
I actually, now that I'm thinking about this, I want to talk, my daughter's 10 years old. Her name's Biella. And I think in the past year, I'm peak cool dad, because Dua Lipa was at our restaurant when she's amazing. Whenever she's in New York, she comes, and I know my daughter loves her so much. And I told my wife one day, like, hey, why don't you bring B to the restaurant tonight at like 6 o'clock? And she did. And they sat next to her. And I thought that could not possibly be topped. And then 2 weeks later, I had dinner with Megan Rapinoe and Sue Bird. And my daughter is really into soccer. And I told my wife again, like, hey, Maria, can you bring B to Misi tonight? And she did. And she took a picture with her. Like Megan Rapinoe and Sue Bird were like, oh my God, I love your sweatshirt. Let me take a picture with you. I honestly, I'll never be cooler ever as a dad. So I peaked when she was 10.
I love that. Kind of in the same vein of behind the scenes, someone in the chat wanted to know, Andrew, why the name change from Dig In to Dig?
Sure. So Dig In for us was sort of synonymous with our quick service restaurants in a very specific style. And Dig is really just, I guess, allowed us to sort of broaden out. We do have a full service restaurant now on Bleecker. We're launching one actually next week called Dig on 4th. It's just a little different take and just getting into different ways. We have a farm under the umbrella Dig now. So just getting into different ways of serving our food, knowing that Dig In was always going to be synonymous with one really specific thing.
I like that. So I know we have some folks on this call who are probably considering changes or pivots, maybe even pivots into or out of the restaurant and hospitality industry. I'll actually ask this question of everyone, but you've each had some pretty interesting pivots in your career. So questions are, one, how did you approach key pivots, or what advice do you have for someone else who's thinking about potentially making a big change?
I think because I wasn't looking for it, and then it just happened, and it changed everything in my being. I have to think about what I did before the restaurants. I in finance, I decided early on in my career that success was in the form of an end of year bonus, a promotion, maybe a job offer from another firm. And sometimes I would hit those goals, sometimes I wouldn't. And the times that I wouldn't, I would think about, what could I have done differently? I was disappointed. I never really felt like I was in complete control. Maybe if the music stopped, my seat wouldn't be there. And it was really scary. And I feel like I would always get myself into this moment of, well, what else are you going to do? You can't do anything else. Just put your head down. It's not too bad. You're living in a 3-bedroom apartment in the West Village. It could be a lot worse. Like, just shut the hell up and keep on doing what you're doing. But then when I opened Lilia and I was there every night, and this thing changed inside of me when even though I was still working in finance, I went to this restaurant every night, and success to me was the people that were working with us coming to work proud every day and making people smile. And that's what moved me. And I could do that forever. It was not a job, which finance was a job. And this thing made me feel like I've never had a Sunday scary since the day Lilia opened. Like, I don't know what day it is ever. I don't care. It just is something that I love doing. So when I break it down like that, it really comes down to that first part of really understanding who you are. So I went to this Jay-Z concert in October 2012, and he says to the crowd, everyone has a genius. And he's the coolest dude ever. And I'm like, that's the coolest thing I've ever heard. But it didn't really hit until I really figured out that thing about Lilia and what it did to change me. It was because I just really comfortable with who I am. And I know what I'm great at, and I know that I'm enough. And I think that will give you some belief in yourself, right? And like, once you get that belief in yourself, then it's just finding something that gets you out of bed, that you could really like get excited about every day. And then it's where you are right now. How do you change it? Put some pen to paper and set some intentions. And they don't have to be crazy. You don't have to change the world. It could literally be, I'm going to run the Williamsburg Bridge tomorrow. Just these little, like, small attainable goals that you could cross off and then write new ones. And over time, you're going to start making some confidence and momentum. And I think it just really, no matter where you are, like, there's no right or wrong answer to go all in on something or do it the way I did it, where I had to work these 2 full-time jobs, but it worked for me. But the real thing that changes you is when you know who you are, not define yourself by a high yield bond trader. That's like the most important thing that I had to figure out. And I luckily did. I'm very blessed.
I love that. Yeah, that really resonates with me in a way less sexy example. But I'm sort of like, I've been a generalist. When I was at UVA, I majored in econ and English. Like, I like change. I don't like being put into a bucket. And there was a time right after business school where there was like a real kind of, especially in tech, pressure to like be a functional specialist. And I just like couldn't find a function that fit me perfectly. And now that I'm more senior in my career, I've sort of embraced, like, I'm a generalist, and that's actually my superpower, is to be like moderately dangerous in everything, not the best at anything. And once I sort of let go of this like attempt to put myself into you're in marketing or you're in sales or you're in finance, I really felt like my career, it was just easier. It was easier for me to sort of find my way in my career. Jacqueline, what about you?
Yeah, I was going to say, I kind of building up of what Sean said, really echo that sentiment. If you look at my trajectory, I had a ton of pivots starting from undergrad. I studied electrical and computer engineering, and I ended up on Wall Street, right? And then while I was on Wall Street, I went from technology to an HR role. Then I went from HR to hospitality. And then even within Caesars, a pretty diverse background. But the thing that's central in all of those pivots, and some of them were hard pivots, but the thing that's central in all of them was that my work was moving me closer and closer to serving people and serving others, because that's what I know that I'm called to do in some form or fashion, is to be of service to others. So I would say, like, identifying similar to what Sean said, but what is it that makes you unique? I genuinely believe that, we all have something that is very unique to us that we are called to do. between our inherent gifts, our skills, our lived experiences. Like we're all going to be put in a situation one day where there's like a problem that you are uniquely, positioned to solve. And I think that pivoting around that, even if it's uncomfortable and scary, like you're going to find success somehow, because that's just, again, kind of just true to like who you are and, what only you can do. And so again, as I think about all of my pivots, the central theme is that, and that's kind of what sustained me. And even now, my job is, as someone said earlier, Andrew said, not for the faint of heart, right? It's not easy by any stretch of the imagination, but it's really rewarding. And what keeps me going and what makes it so rewarding is that I know the impact that I'm having not only on my team of 2,000 team members who work for me at the Tropicana, but again, as I said, the guests, right? And then really the community element. And so that's what kind of sustains me through all.
I love that. Andrew, anything to add?
Yeah. I guess what comes to mind to me is I don't think I've pivoted. There was, I guess, a lot of luck in the direction I started. But what comes to mind to me is that Sean and Jackie just shared like a really great ways to think about these types of decisions. But I think inherent, and you could hear both of them say it, is there's still a ton of risk and uncertainty.
Yeah.
And what I've seen a lot of people that I've interacted with, particularly young ones, don't recognize is the opportunity cost of waiting. The sort of the cost of making these changes tends to go up as you get older, with responsibilities, hubris, or whatever. And oftentimes you're not going to learn these critical things about yourself. You might have ideas, but you're not going to learn them until you make some of these big moves. So I think it is important to evaluate these things and do the best you can and put everything into these decisions, but also get comfortable with a little bit of uncertainty in realizing that if you don't make some of these moves, you might not ever find that thing. You might never what fills you up. So just keeping that in mind, that the earlier you are in career, it typically only gets harder to make these moves, almost never easier. And there's never going to be a perfect time where it lines up.
Yeah. And something I get out of kind of what everyone said is just don't be afraid to fail, because like failing is not an end state, right? Like you could say that pump failed, but actually, like, to me, that's a successful pivot because you saw, okay, what health food is changing. So I'm going to change with it. And I think often we think like, oh, if I don't nail this exact next thing, what will my resume look like? Or like, what will my network think? And the reality is like, I don't think there's a single successful person out there who doesn't have an amazing failure story. And I think like once you let go of that fear of like making this exact thing work out perfectly, you can really go somewhere.
I so agree with that. Somebody told me a while ago, what is the worst part of failure? I think most of us have an ego, or our egos will be hurt.
Yes.
And I think there has to become this realization that no one really gives a shit about you as much as you. So like when you're looking in yourself in the mirror when you failed, like nobody else is really caring about you as much as you care about that. So once you get rid of that, once you understand that, the lessons learned is the worst part of failing. And how bad is that? Like, that's a beautiful thing. So once you get through that, like ego being hurt and I wonder what they're thinking about me, like they don't care about you. They're not thinking about you. They're thinking about them. So like you are the one that cares most about you, and just think about how you come back. And I think about grit, it doesn't have to mean struggle. Grit to me, like when you're failing on something, make mistakes, you'll find grit because you're loving what you're doing. You're passionate about what you're doing. It's going to get you through everything. You're in pursuit of something that is extraordinarily exciting to you. So to me, failure is just getting over that feeling that, oh God, I wonder what they're going to think about me. Like, they're not thinking about you. It's you.
I love that. And I would say, just kind of piggybacking off of that, my thought was like, ask yourself, like, what is the worst that can happen? And that sounds super basic, but like ask yourself that several times, right? Like it's similar to the 5 whys exercise, right? Like keep asking why to get to the root. Like ask yourself that question, what's the worst that can happen? So you're gonna have an answer and then say like, and then you're gonna have an answer and right. And ultimately, and I have to go to the exercise myself, by the way, but ultimately, like it comes down to what you said, Sean, right? When people first ask themselves that question, it's hard for them to get to like, what's the worst that can happen? Oh, I won't have a job. Okay. And what, right? You get another job. Oh, well, X, Y, and Z. And I think what it ultimately comes down to is what you just pointed to, which is like, it's, oh, my ego. It's what it is, that whatever it is that's in my head and worrying about what other people think. And if you shed that and truly answer that question, like, what's the worst thing that can happen? I think that's freeing. This is a little bit of a do as I say, not as I do yet, because I'm working it out myself. But I was recently going through that same exercise.
I love that. Well, I think that's a great place to turn it back over to Anthony. You know, if the most important thing about pivots is they're not permanent, and don't be afraid of what could happen. So Anthony, I'll turn it over to you now. I think you're going to moderate Q&A. So thank you, big thank you to all of our panelists. This has been awesome so far.
Yeah, thanks, Katie. That is awesome. And I was just sitting here thinking, like, everyone thinks about, when you think about hospitality schools, you know, Cornell pops into mind, or UNLV or other places. But I think tonight is a great example that University of Virginia graduates excel at just whatever it is that they decide to do. So just another plug for UVA.
Wow.
Exactly.
Wow, that's right.
So, you know, I did forget real quick before we get into Q&A, was wanted to thank Jackie, who you all read the invite, generously donated a giveaway for tonight's event of a free night at the Tropicana in Atlantic City with a meal credit. So that is exciting. Anyone who was entered in, anyone who's a member of the Virginia Club will be entered into that drawing, and I'm sure Lilia will reach out to you later. So thank you for that, and thank you to all the panelists for your time. So for everyone else out there, I've seen a couple of questions come through the chat. If you do have other questions, throw them in the Q&A or the chat. I want to put Katie on the spot real quick though, with a question for me. So I was running a restaurant in New York City on March 16th, 2020, the day the pandemic hit, and I empathize with everything that everyone else spoke about. We laid off 100 people, and our worlds collapsed, and we had to open up the next morning and figure out how to do delivery and takeout. And so everyone, you know, all the other panelists spoke about how kind of our worlds were flipped upside down. And my question to you is, DoorDash, it seems like, had the opposite experience, where on March 16th, 2020, there was a opportunity that had never been there before.
And really where it was happening was at Caviar. So our acquisition had closed 4 months prior. And so we weren't one company yet, you know, we're still sorting out the details of that. And all of a sudden, all these premium restaurants who told me, you know, never in a million years would we deliver, our sales team, like, phones were ringing off the hook starting on March 12th in New York. So it was.
So that's my question. How did it change for you guys? How did you manage the change, you know, in the other direction from what everyone else kind of was experiencing at that time?
Yeah, I mean, this is where it's interesting, because for me personally, I had a baby on March 19th. So I sort of saw like a week of intensity, and then I had a couple of months of a very different kind of intensity. So I've gotten to almost like look back and hear from the team about what that very intense period of April and May and June looked like, and learn from it in retrospect by studying it. But, you know, one of the values that is very true at DoorDash is a value of 1% better every day. And the way that shows up at work is essentially, we set really rigorous, big goals, but we literally manage the business daily, right? Like, we're delivering at 24 hours a day, we're always on. And so to manage an operational business, you have to be managing on a daily basis. And so in many ways, like, that operational rigor and that willingness to make decisions on a daily basis that sort of affect our direction was a really good foundation for the team to respond to daily changes. And essentially it was all hands on deck. I mean, from a Caviar standpoint, there was all of this, like, how should we integrate the teams and, normal things you would think about after big M&A. This was DoorDash's first major acquisition at the time. And we just put all of that on hold. And the main thing we thought about was, like, number one, do what's right for our restaurants. And that was really the first, like, audience we thought about mobilizing for. Number two, do what's right for our dashers. Like, very quickly we thought about, okay, how do we get PPEs, kind of what Jackie was talking about, like, use our purchasing power to make sure that every single person who's going out there when it's risky can do so as safely as possible. And then number three, our customers, especially as people started to be really sick in New York, like, often we were the one way that you could get, broth to your friend who's alone and sick with COVID. So yeah, it was really like an all hands on deck sort of wartime vibe of, like, daily, not even daily, multiple times a day stand-ups. But in some ways, like, the culture that DoorDash had already established, which was already this, like, very fast-paced daily decision-making, I think helped us navigate through it. But I do think, like, folks are tired, and I think folks are in the restaurant industry are tired too. And so we're really now trying to think about, okay, this is the new normal. How do we build sustainability and make sure that people are filling their own cups, even though the business never stops? Like, we have to make sure every employee is taking the breaks that they need to be able to, have the horsepower to keep going on a daily and minute by minute business.
Awesome. Very fascinating. Thanks for sharing that experience. So change pace a little bit here. And Sean, this is for you from Ronak. And he was curious about.
Ronak was my intern.
Oh, all right. So what does the perfect culinary education program look like to you?
Of course, he asked that question. He's the smartest person that's ever worked at our company, by the way. I think it's a really exciting time in culinary education. I think there's a massive opportunity to create the greatest culinary school in the world right now. And it is about culinary arts, hospitality, entrepreneurship through experiential learning. And that starts in high school, and especially in New York City right now, where we have the ability with youth to foster these great traits and these kids that want to be in hospitality and take care of people. And then how does that translate after their 4 years of high school in a way where they could possibly get an associate's degree or a bachelor degree with full employment? And I think that's the great opportunity we have right now. It's about experiential learning. We have the greatest restaurants in the world in New York City. We have the greatest hotels in the world in New York City. We have this amazing opportunity that a lot of buildings in New York City aren't being used because people don't come to work in them anymore. And I would love in my next 10 years to see one of the greatest culinary institutions established ever here, where we get these kids from high schools all over New York City or the world, and in 2 to 3 years, for an affordable way, where right now you go to a culinary school, it just doesn't, we get kids from culinary schools all the time at our restaurants, and we just haven't had the same success as we've had with these young New Yorkers who are in culinary high schools. And those kids are paying $150,000 for the CIA and Johnson Wales. And I think we could do it better. I think it's broken. And that to me is exciting. We have islands that are not being used for anything right now, that are amazing hubs of hospitality in the future. And anybody wants to come this summer, we're going to do MP dining experiences on Governor's Island. I think that island is going to be really exciting going forward for this city. It's untapped. And yeah, Ronak, great question. That was a surprise, Ronak. I love that. By the way, very short story here about Ronak.
I love that. Yes.
Jefferson Scholar. I get a call from my dear friend who runs Jefferson Scholarship Program down there with the students, Ben Skipper. I lived on the lawn with him, and he goes,
Ben Skipper interviewed me for the Jeff Scholarship when I was in high school.
Skip
Nashville.
Skip is a special man. And he called me up, and I had taken a UVA summer intern the year before. This is 2018. He's like, hey, I got a kid. He's not in college yet, but he's awesome. He lives in New Jersey. And I'm like, a high school kid? He's like, yeah, he's going to be amazing. So Ronak came up, and interned with us, and we've stayed close. He's about to graduate his 4th year in 2 weeks. And he's obviously going to get he already got a great job in finance. He's not going to hospitality yet. But last summer, Ronak's brother, who is a senior in high school, going to be a senior in high school, he is going to be a LeBron James in the hospitality world. And he interned at our restaurant, Misi. And I have now had this big discussion with Ronak, his brother Arman, and their mother. And Arman is going to take a gap year and come open the pizzeria in Williamsburg with me, because he's an absolute savant. And he's going to be our pizza maker, this 18-year-old prodigy. And you'll hear that name. But Ronak, great question. And hopefully I'll give your brother the best culinary education possible.
Ronak just learned no good question goes unpunished.
Exactly. Don't worry, Ronak. You'll be, if you follow Sean or me or many other people, you'll leave finance for hospitality in no time.
You'll be the next.
Firmly believe you. Yeah, Katie.
Well, Ronak's going to make a lot of money, and he's going to finance his brother's restaurants.
There you go.
Good.
That's the way to do it. So, all right. So we'll switch over here for a minute to Jackie, and this question's from Allison. And I think a lot of us would echo this question, which is, what is the most difficult part of the day-to-day management of such a large and complex operation?
So I'd say number one is trying to balance the fact that you need to be really strategic, right? If you're running an operation of this size, we do $326 million in revenue in 2021, I should say. If you're running a business of that size, you need to be strategic and figuring out how do you keep that going, how you're growing revenue, how you're driving EBITDA, et cetera. But then you also need to deal with like the day-to-day and fire drills, almost like, literally and figuratively speaking. I'll give you for example, a week ago, not this past Friday, the previous Friday, there was a power outage in the city of Atlantic City, a raccoon. Who knew? But raccoons can be troublesome little critters.
I read about this.
Yeah, troublesome little critters, like blew out a transformer, we lost half the grid in Atlantic City. And a building of my size, I have 5 different hotel towers, right? It's not one building, it's 5 buildings, 5 hotel towers connected by various things, 5 or 6 city blocks long. We lost power. And a building of that size, you would say, well, don't you have backup power? Yes, we do. However, the switchgear failed. I know way more about electrical equipment than I ever thought I would know at this point in my career. Switchgear failed. And so we have a full-on power outage in the building on a Friday night, which is like the weekend, right? So that's peak. So I'm on a conference call troubleshooting this until a solid, I think, 3 o'clock in the morning, Friday. We finally get it resolved a few hours later, and you think, okay, that's a once in a career thing. It won't happen again, until it happened again on Tuesday. And so a few days later, it happened again for another reason, just old buildings, things happen. And so we were without power in one tower this time. So just one, but we were out power in one tower for 14 hours. And so think about trying to navigate through that, because that particular tower was also the gaming floor. So essentially we had no gaming floor for 14 hours. That's where you make the majority of your revenue. And so navigating the logistics of that, the communication, the coordination, the impact on the guests, the impact on team members, et cetera. And it's 24/7, right? So those are the types of things that can happen in an operation of that size. But then, oh, by the way, you're also, called to think strategically. I'd say that's probably the most difficult part of the job, balancing both.
Great. Well, thank you for that. And, I would have never guessed that the root cause was a raccoon of that.
Raccoons and squirrels, apparently, not good for electricity.
It's always something though, right? You can't predict what it's going to be. You'll get beaten by something.
Yeah, it's like the strategy is the easy part, and the hard part is just like all of the execution 24/7 every day.
Yes.
Yeah,
yes.
absolutely.
Contending with raccoons.
Yeah. So kind of to stay in the same vein, Andrew, do you have any examples of, something like that that's like, it doesn't have to be a power outage caused by a raccoon, but anything like that that's occurred, over the last 15 years with DIG that kind of same scale where you just didn't expect it and you had to kind of strategize a quick way out?
Andy jumps out. Ooh. Most of the restaurants were underwater at that point, and you have no visibility. So you're just, I don't have a car in New York City, getting a hold of a car, driving around, just seeing what's going on, shifting the business left, shifting it right, trying to save your supply center, your supply chain. That was a crazy time. And I guess it's been a while at this point, so don't remember it. It felt like the power was out in Manhattan for a good week, 2 weeks. I don't know. It's just, it wasn't quick either. And that was pretty surreal time too. If any of you all were in New York City, a lot of the norms, and it's similar to COVID that you thought you'd see just sort of changed upside down. Like, what happens in New York City when none of the traffic lights are working? Yeah, I think Sandy was a pretty wild time for us. Similar experience that many of you all have mentioned, where you're doing multiple stand-ups a day. And I think really good teams know that it's almost impossible to over communicate in those situations. And you feel like you have no time, but the poise to just over communicate usually does end up saving your tail in the end and saving a bunch of time. Yeah, and that was pretty early in the game for me. That was a big moment, sort of getting through that in terms of a confidence builder, to be honest.
Yeah, I'm sure. I am sure. Yeah, I think there's like key moments in everyone's career that they kind of remember. And that's certainly, I know a lot of people in hospitality always speak back to Sandy and where they were and how they dealt with it here in New York, for sure. So with that, I just want to wrap this up and thank Katie and Sean and Andrew and Jackie again for taking the time to share their expertise, their experience, their insight with us on this panel tonight about pivots in the hospitality industry. It's been really great to hear from all of you, different perspectives, and I echo Juli's amazing conversation. It was great to hear all of you. And thank you everyone who was able to join tonight. If you missed part of the event or want to hear it again, it will be on our YouTube, on the UVA Virginia Club YouTube channel. I'm sure that Lilia will be sending out more information about that as well. And again, thanks to the University of Virginia Office of Engagement, the Virginia Club of New York, and Lilia for helping us to put this event on. And lastly, for those of you that like to take part in Virginia Club of New York events, the Who's in Entrepreneurship group will be meeting on June 3rd for a morning coffee. So everyone's welcome over at the Navy Yard in Brooklyn. And I know there's a fun Who's Hungry event coming up in July. So we hope to see you all at one of those events or one of the many other Virginia Club of New York events in the near future. So thanks a lot and look forward to seeing you all soon.